So what do you do when you have people saying something or you have people saying things that contradict each other? Like you said, Cyprian says one thing, Jerome sounds like he says another. Well, you believe the facts. What did these people actually do? And what they actually do is uh, a better way of communicating what they really believed, right? Like put your money where your mouth is the modern American expression of, all right, if you really mean it, you put your money where your mouth is. Anyone could say, I'm pro, let's say, bringing endless immigrants to the country. Well, do you bring them to your house? Well, no. Well, it shows you there's limitations to how people feel about these things.
Right.
And so that being said, the same is true in church history is you believe facts rather than the words. You look at their actions and not just their words in isolation. And when we look at their actions, especially the whole papal way of twisting the words makes no sense because no one held to this papal view because their actions are always categorically inconsistent with this post-schism papal view. And I've just never heard any decent response to this, I think, self-apparent and self-validating historical methodology.
Hello and welcome to Cleave to Antiquity. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, Craig Truglia. Thank you so much for coming on the channel.
It's good to be here.
Absolutely. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
It's always tough to introduce oneself because if you want to say your accolades, you sound proud. If you don't say it, you sound like, well, why is this guy here? So I will try my best. I'm essentially a part-time missionary and historian. I say part-time because it's not my full-time job. I do have an Episcopal blessing to do it. So I every so often will publish an academic article. I've published a couple books. You can see up there. I do missionary work once a year in Cambodia and assist the churches there and with fundraising there. That's what the medal behind me is for from the bishop in Singapore. And essentially, why I like doing this is first, the forgiveness that we have, in Jesus Christ, what he's done for us in the cross and his resurrection. How could he not live your life, even if you got other jobs and commitments, to still do his will and to evangelize? And the second thing is I do have a sincere, just academic, interest in a lot of these matters. And so that's what really interested me about this interview.
Absolutely. But one thing that really caught my eye about your channel was a video that you had posted that I thought was very well done out. It was like a documentary style video. It was called the Errors of the Catholics. You went over a ton, absolute motherload of information dumped into that video. If you guys have not seen that video, I'll link it in the description here so you can check it out. But why don't you talk a little bit about some of the information contained within that video and some of the findings that you have found while reviewing church history in reference to that particular issue?
That video was done really great. The editor being the other Paul, and he did all the creative visual and audio aspects. And he was the narrator. He did an excellent job, and I think his voice sounds better than mine presenting that information. The importance of the documentary, The Errors of the Catholics, it's a very polemical title. But again, because I'm a history nerd, it's just a kind of ironic twisting of Errors of the Greeks from Thomas Aquinas. So it's not that I'm trying to tread new in-your-face polemical grounds or anything like that. But when it comes to titles, but when it comes to apologetics, I was trying to bring something to the table that we haven't heard before. Because a big problem in apologetics is we keep repeating the same arguments that the Anglicans, high church Anglicans, the Roman Catholics were having in the 1800s and early 1900s. And all the arguments, even if there's Orthodox thrown in the fray, are just rephrasings and retwistings of these things. Kind of like AI is a kind of kaleidoscope that does an internet search and just puts it in eloquent words, relatively speaking, considering it's a computer. But it doesn't really give you new information. It doesn't really critically think and analyze information. And it doesn't have access to resources that aren't, what's it called when it's public after 100 years? Open source.
Right.
And so Errors of the Catholics was on purpose a way to try to address all these polemical issues in not a lot of time with new resources people haven't saw, with sort of smoking guns all along the way, because the idea is to have a lot of information very quickly, brand new information, definitive information. And in that, the film's been very successful, has over 100,000 views, and no one's made any responses to it or anything like that. And it's because once one gets deep in the history and the primary sources, you start finding there are no responses from these things. That while, let's say, a magisterial Protestant or a traditional Roman Catholic or a traditional Orthodox worldview is going to be cogent, right? You can't, if once you get into it, easily poke holes, because nothing lasts hundreds or thousands of years if it's completely mindless, right? There's some sort of consistent worldview, and one has to actually start interacting with that worldview to start finding actual inconsistencies. Like, not everything's like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, where like the errors are just so flagrant in your face. You can make South Park episodes that make fun of it that are actually fairly accurate as to like what the problems really are. But that being said, it's when you study the history, you start finding these inconsistencies. And to some degree, we all have these. And I think we'll end up teasing some of these. We all have these. With the Roman Catholic, their problem is the way they've doctrinally developed, their inconsistencies and problem have become systematic errors that are essentially system defeaters, as people may say on the internet, that it makes ultimately the system incoherent if one understands what actually exists historically in that tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't you give us, for those that haven't watched the video, maybe a brief highlight of some of the arguments, some of the things that were brought up about Vigilius and Honorius, I thought were pretty poignant. Can you give us kind of a brief summary of some of the, like, maybe highlights of what they can expect to see in that video?
Sure. So like with Vigilius and Honorius, to say very briefly, Pope Vigilius endorsed a document that was Nestorian and said it was Orthodox. And so if there's papal infallibility and he decrees this document is Orthodox and it's not, then it sort of undoes the system. And I say sort of because, of course, there's the original apologetic is that, like, it didn't happen and all that stuff. But to make a long story short, generally people say is, well, he was trying to teach orthodoxy, but he made an error in fact, not a formal theological error, or in these sort of distinctions. And you start finding, of course, if we make enough distinctions, we can undo any error. Say it was an error in this fashion, but not in that fashion. And ex post facto, the only thing that really matters if we don't have an error in this fashion. All these other errors are okay. But at the end of the day, when someone from the Roman Catholic apologetics world is evangelizing, let's say, a Protestant, their false bag of goods is that you don't have any sort of theological certainty in anything because you can't settle it in any sort of way. So Scriptura can't do this, but we have a papacy that can. But when you get into the actual historical nitty gritty, that's just not true. They have errors, and they have it where the Pope didn't settle something, had to do a total 180, blame Satan for the 180, by the way, which is discussed in the film, which is interesting, right? If you're divinely protected, and yet the Pope flat out says Satan has deceived him and his chancellery. And with Honorius, it's very interesting because he actually invented the word that became the next heresy, metathelitism, which I could get into details, but I won't hear unless there's questions about that. And to make a long story short, he teaches this error. He gets anathematized by ecumenical council for teaching this error. He gets anathematized by subsequent popes for centuries for teaching this error. And in the next ecumenical council, Nicaea II, it even flat out says for teaching the error. So not for allowing it in a lot of these distinctions. It's, well, he taught the error. Mm-hmm. And so these would be charitably said system defeaters, as long as we're not going to ad hoc come up with endless distinctions, say, well, yes, he taught error, but not in this way. Or yes, this ecumenical council said he taught error, but it didn't say in its decree that it taught error. So that means the ecumenical council is an error when it said all these things. But let's speak like normal human beings for a second, right? Right. No normal person, if we're having a conversation, is going to deal with anything in truth that way. It'd be like finding out your wife's cheating on you and says, well, what's the definition of cheating? I cheated in this way. Now that would that really be meaningful
Yeah,
in
yeah.
that situation? And of course, absolutely not. And as a historian, right? And I'm not gonna say capital H, I'm not vocationally a historian, but having published history and doing historical studies, um, all I could say is historically speaking, there is no papal infallibility communicated. Historically speaking, people just presumed popes can make doctrinal errors. Historically speaking, all these distinctions didn't exist. No one communicated the existence of these distinctions. It's an idea that occurred to no one. And so, historically speaking, the modern post-schism Roman Catholic worldview is just historically non-existent. And I could say that pretty objectively, not being polemical. It just doesn't objectively exist in the historical data in the first 1,000 years.
Yeah, and I think the Vatican is kind of backed off on some of those claims and some of these ecumenical dialogues that they've had, like the Chieti document, in which they
Yeah.
openly admit that the Bishop of Rome did not have canonical authority over the Church in the East for the first 1,000 years. I think it's a pretty big concession. But some of the things that you had mentioned in the video, I thought were pretty poignant, especially since the common claim of, especially in apologetics circles within the Roman Catholic worldview, they'll state that the ecumenical councils are subject to the judgment of the Pope rather than the other way around. But then here you have specific instances in which popes are excommunicated or anathematized, after the fact. So it's kind of interesting to see that contrast throughout history. What are your thoughts about some of that?
Well, what confuses people is that there's a little bit of both in church discipline. And a lot of the nuances are covered in that book up there, Rise and Fall of the Papacy. What we see is in pop apologetics, and even to be fair, in a lot of scholarship, there isn't a full understanding of exactly how the ecclesiology of the early church operated. Generally speaking, people talk about papalism versus conciliarism, and that's not fully right because conciliarism kind of implies you have maybe all the bishops are like all many popes and their unified decision is like a papal decision, or which already is kind of on this sort of papal paradigm, right? It's presuming a Roman Catholic paradigm of thought. What I talk about in the book is that there's a consensus-based ecclesiology. Now, and this is what we see in Acts chapter 15, is that there's the apostles, the priests, or the elders, depending on your translation, but the term is presbyter in the Greek, and the people, right? And so all these people function in the receiving of the counsel. Now, the people don't teach, right? They don't have identical functions. For what it's worth, not even the presbyters give teachers. We only have apostles giving actual views during the council. But what we see is a unified decision that's organic. So why do I bring this up? I bring this up because historically speaking, we do run into instances where there's a council and the Bishop of Rome and his synod, so his bishops with him, and also the populace that they represent, reject something that happens in the East. And generally speaking, usually when this occurs, it's not just Rome, it's someone else with them, like Alexandria or something like that. Which, again, it's not just a city, not just a patriarch, represents all these people in Egypt, all these Christians in Egypt.
Right.
And so what we see is this organic working out of a consensus and a rejection for something that doesn't have a consensus. And that's what gets left out in a lot of these discussions. Because when we think of these things, we think of maybe congregationalism, where everyone has a vote. And, just like the Roman Republic, though it's a republic, didn't work that way. It wasn't a direct democracy. In fact, historical direct democracies didn't empower everyone to vote. So like a lot of these ideas we have are very anachronistic. But neither is it monarchical. And that's what people misunderstand. They think if the Pope of Rome says something, or if the Pope of Alexandria or some other patriarch says something, that settles something for those people. But there's more to it. There's a synod at work. And so there's a little bit of both. You do have where even jurisdictions, like, for example, the city of Milan and the bishop didn't accept parts of the Fifth Ecumenical Council while accepting the rest of the Fifth Ecumenical Council. Why is this relevant? It shows you that the Bishop of Rome, when he, let's say, he vetoes something, that's not something that he individually has and no one else has, right? Everyone has a right to a vote. And not everyone has to vote for something. And like a line item veto, they don't have to accept everything there is. So I know someone listening to this, they probably never heard of this before unless they read that book. And so that's why the pop apologetic world really doesn't do justice. It gives you a paradigm as to it's either this or it's that. And the truth doesn't fit either option they give you.
Right. Yeah, it definitely seems to be more, I don't know if this is the right term for it, but like a synodal model where the leadership is getting together and making these various decisions. Like you said, it's not congregational or not congregational. It's not like all of the lay people that belong to that territory are voting. It's the bishops getting together and making these decrees, and it's not just the decision of the Bishop of Rome. Like, yes, he's consulted. Yes, he is coming in and oftentimes sending legates to sign off on certain things, but oftentimes it's because he's deferring or really requesting the guidance of his fellow bishops as well. It's not just like you said, it's not a monarchy in which he's just kind of making these bland or blanket statement decrees over the entire church or anything like that.
And sometimes it's a little less charitable than that. Like sometimes the Pope of Rome, particularly in later centuries, because he starts becoming the political head of really its own sort of country,
Hmm.
starts speaking like a king of a country. This is
Right.
how we're going to do things, and you start seeing people respond to it. This is how we're going to do things, right? They
Yeah.
kind of respond just as muscularly, um, and so this is where the politics of the early church starts becoming intertwined with the theological and religious functions of the church. And so oftentimes in apologetics, we make everything like it's very high minded and in the realm of religion and piety. And the actual mechanisms and working out of these things sometimes are very worldly. And that's just reality. Same is true with stuff in the Protestant Reformation as well, by the way. There's a reason why all the magisterial Protestant churches were state churches, like Lutheranism in Germany and Dutch Reformed and et cetera, et cetera. And so studying it historically, we can never divorce the political machinations. I'd say as Christians, most charitably, we could look at these things as God's providence, right? That there were these systems of government, and for better or for worse, this is what God permitted to exist, and it led to these certain outcomes. Because a lot of these synodal decisions aren't even bishops in isolation; they need the support of prominent archimandrites and monastics of the civil government, which again represents the people. And so this would make a lot of sense until after the French Revolution, the idea that civil government has a serious say in these ecclesiastical matters. But today that sounds very bizarre because
Yeah.
we're not used to it.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely. I think there's an issue with pop apologetics, and oftentimes that's what I address on my channel is some of these poor arguments that are put forth on many different sides. But one of the ones that I hear quite often in support of papal supremacy in the first millennium is people will cite individuals like Jerome, who was very pro-West, and he said some very slanderous things about the bishops in the East. But then you also have within the same time period people like, or maybe even a little earlier, you have Cyprian that will be writing against, the Pope at the time and stating that none of us set ourselves up as bishop of bishops as you're trying to do, and kind of pushing back on some of his political pushes for more and more power over the church. So you definitely have to take the writings within their context. People are political creatures, so there's going to be a bias depending on what author you're reading. So you do have to kind of flavor the text with the political situation at the time as well.
Yes, this is the problem with quote mine apologetics versus actually reading the sources. And to be fair to people that maybe just listen to a podcast like yours or like mine, or just look at the blogs and not actually read the books and stuff, they maybe as much as they can handle. And this is why I feel Satan sowed schisms and heresies, because we can't process all this information. And that's just reality. It's only by the grace of God could we even remotely process anything of the things of God. And so, but the speaking very matter of factly, it's a lot of information, people can't process it. And so like they read something from Saint Jerome on the question of let's say the papacy, and they go, it sounds like he's saying all that matters is the Pope. But if read in context and both letters, you could tell he's actually very politely saying no to the Pope. I don't agree with you.
Right.
And so people get the exact opposite of what the letter is saying because they don't understand diplomatic writing. Now, like there's a real great movie, the Luther movie made in Germany like 20 years ago. It's all in English. Anyone could watch it. And there's a very interesting exchange between Luther and the local German prince, and they're talking about these political matters. And the German prince, it's apocryphal because the prince never met Luther in real life, but in this conversation in the movie, the prince says to Luther that when you say no to, how do you say no to someone who's more powerful than you? He's like, first, you could just say nothing. And then if you have to give a response because saying nothing doesn't work, you say no in such a way that is just so kind that it just doesn't offend them. And you wait for time and inertia to change matters where you don't have to really follow what they told you. And then the last option is where that doesn't work is the fight. And so obviously the way the prince politically saw things is first he say nothing. Then if he can't say nothing, then he say no in such a kind way. And then the third thing is actually to directly contradict the person. Now, diplomatically, of course, this makes sense. So divorced from anything else, people say, okay, obviously people could operate this way. Now, when you read those letters, understanding and admitting, yes, these are the three ways Jerome could respond to a situation. And you look at the details in those letters, you realize it's number two that Jerome's doing. He's saying no in such a nice way that the Pope can't contradict him. And in fact, the Pope ended up changing his policy. And that's what people don't talk about. The Pope reversed his policy, entered into communion with Meletius. He sent a synodal document with anathemas in it for Meletius to accept, which Meletius accepted, other than one of the anathemas, which would have called into question his ordination, which shows you just because the Pope signed it doesn't mean everyone else is going to uncritically accept it. And the Pope re-entered communion with Meletius. So if you actually have all the context, now again, I had to read academic books for a lot of this stuff, but if you had the context, you'd realize this sort of quoting St. Jerome, it doesn't make sense. But let's not go to nitty gritty and just look at this. How does a normal person try to understand these questions? And it's one of my favorite one-liners in church history. It's in the bottom, in the back of my book. And it's a quote from St. Gregory the Great, who's a Pope of Rome, where he says, believe facts rather than words. So what do you do when you have people saying something or you have people saying things that contradict each other? Like you said, Cyprian says one thing, Jerome sounds like he says another. Well, you believe the facts. What did these people actually do? And what they actually do is a better way of communicating what they really believed, right? Like put your money where your mouth is the modern American expression of, all right, if you really mean it, you put your money where your mouth is. Anyone could say, I'm pro, let's say, bringing endless immigrants in the country. Well, do you bring them to your house? Well, no. Well, it shows you there's limitations to how people feel about these things.
Right.
And so that being said, the same is true in church history is you believe facts rather than the words. You look at their actions and not just their words in isolation. And when we look in their actions, especially the whole papal way of twisting the words makes no sense because no one held to this papal view because their actions are always categorically inconsistent with this post-schism papal view. And I've just never heard any decent response to this, I think, self-apparent and self-validating historical methodology. Right? To me, this is a choice in historical methodology, which is obvious and self-evident, and it's by purposefully ignoring this superior methodological approach that you come to different conclusions. So it's like, all right, I don't agree with you, but it's because I have this different methodology. And so that's why in apologetics, which is not necessarily historical discourse, it's the explanation of the faith, I tried to talk about methodology because people have to be privy. They have to be self-aware of what methodology am I really ascribing to, right? Otherwise, it's just sophistry. If we just listen to the nicest thing we hear, you could be convinced of anything. So
Right.
even as a passive observer, you should have some sort of methodology. some idea like, well, yeah, I do think people should put their money where their mouth is. So I don't listen to this person that says this, but then does that. So if you could do that with real life, you could do that, of course, with questions of religious and historical importance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's extremely important for people to actually listen to kind of both sides of the argument before you make your determination. The papal supremacy argument, I feel like, is very difficult to defend because it's such a bold claim to claim that there was papal supremacy, not primacy, right, but supremacy
Yeah.
within the
Yeah.
first millennium. You can see examples of primacy. Supremacy, though, that would be like claiming I had the ability to fly for 1,000 years, but I never did it.
Yeah.
Which is what the Chieti document basically says is the case in the case of papal primacy. It admits or supremacy, and admits that they didn't exercise canonical authority over the East at all during that time. They didn't do it. It's not like they were like, oh, I'm head of the entire thing. Now you go do my bidding. That's not the way that it works. I think it's a very kind of black and white
It creates a
wrong
very
way.
self-serving hermeneutic where every action in word where the Pope doesn't act upon what is actually an extra canonical ecclesiastical authority of supremacy, because there's no canon that delineates supremacy, right? Not even post-schism, really. That which is why they had to have Vatican I. They had their own issues kind of grappling with that. That it forces them to have a hermeneutic that everything is a condescension in the part of the Pope. Well, yes, he did this, but that was out of condescension. Yes, he said this, but that was out of condescension.
Right.
And so it becomes, well, he never meant what he was doing. He never meant what he said. And there's a certain point it's like, well, on what basis do we say this if he never even communicated this idea in the first millennium? It's never even communicated. So it's speaking as a historian, you can't take it seriously. Now, there is a worldview within modern Roman Catholicism, which is cogent. There's a philosophy to it, and there's an epistemology to it. But historically speaking, people just have to say there's just no written basis for it in the first millennium. And so then it becomes a methodological question. Well, does that invalidate it or not? Now, of course, in common parlance, it does, right? And in no common sense would we accept the existence of something that's absent for 1,000 years and pretend it always existed. But if you want to get to nitty gritty philosophically, why, that's a longer question, of course.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I know that we were talking a little bit about ecumenical councils as we were prepping for this communication here. So I wanted to kind of dive into some of the things we were talking about regarding that, like historical applications of the canons of ecumenical councils. And you had mentioned something that I thought was interesting that is found in your book. You were talking about this kind of like praxis shift in the modern application of canons. Do you want to go into that a little bit?
I mean, that's a really, really big can of worms, and I wouldn't know where to start. So maybe let me start with a fact, and then maybe we could deconstruct this.
Sure.
And so this is me just speaking historically, matter of factly. I'm not going to give an apologetic or defense for this, but I'll say this: in the first 1,000 years of church history, all the canons of local councils were pretty much treated like ecumenical canons. They're all treated with equal authority. And this is validated by the fact that all the local canons were to be accepted by ecumenical councils, other than finally the council in the year 920, which was it's arguably the untold Ninth Ecumenical, because even the Pope of Rome ended up accepting it. But this is a very obscure question. It's not published on. I've seen stuff that's never been translated, so that's why I'm commenting on that. But the point is, Orthodox canon law that we have today does come from the year 920, and it includes every local council that existed in the East and those that were accepted in the West prior to Chalcedon in the first millennium. And so this kind of makes sense if you understand that in Matthew chapter 18, Christ says, where 2 or 3 meet in my name, there I am in the midst of them. There wasn't this idea that when a council met, what they did was somehow optional or just their opinion or just it's prudent to follow us.
Right.
What they spoke was, no, we've done this. This is definitive. The Holy Spirit is speaking through us. And even the heretics would say things like this because this was the commonly understood ecclesiology. It sounds crazy, but again, I'm speaking as historian. This is how they understood and explains about what they were doing, okay? You don't have to agree with them. I'm just saying this is how they understood themselves. Now, starting in the second, well, when it comes to Western canon law, this fell apart very quick, and we could get into details. But let me just speak very briefly about Orthodox canon law. Orthodox canon law doesn't stop after 920. After
Right.
920, you start having Orthodox canon law that goes in essentially three directions. And this is where there's a praxis shift, because the first direction is obviously all the councils we agreed upon, including the local ones, are speaking by God. Up to the year 920, we still agree with that. So, right, that still exists post 920. But then there's these two other directions. The first other direction is you have what is called jurisprudence. You start having canonists giving interpretations and civil law giving interpretations of canons and applying canons. And that civil law and those interpretations become like their own canon. Now, anyone who understands like actual English common law and how, let's say, the Supreme Court operates in the United States, jurisprudence is very common, right? It borders on law, how previous judges have determined things. But it's a praxis shift because it's not necessarily, like I could give it defense, but it's not necessarily nakedly how it operated in the first millennium.
Right.
Where you start having civil law and canonical interpretations really stepping in the place of making new canons, because it seems like they just don't want to make pan-Orthodox canons anymore. Then even though there's certain interpretations that border on pan-Orthodox, because you got canonists that are accepted by everyone. So it's sort of like we have pan-Orthodox jurisprudence, but it's just not pan-Orthodox canons. It serves the same function, but it's a praxis shift. People don't talk about this. They're not aware of this. Now, I'm not a canon law expert. I'm just speaking historically. There's a praxis shift. I'll leave it to a proper Orthodox canonist to explain the nuances of this. I can only speak of this historically. The second praxis shift is that of local councils issuing their own local canons, which for whatever reason have never gained to pan-Orthodox assent, which is inconsistent with what has happened with every local Eastern Council in the first millennium, which all attained to Catholic universal acceptance in the Orthodox Church. So, for example, the country of Georgia issued canons. The Antiochian jurisdiction in the 1600s, when the Turks stopped oppressing them as much, issued many canons. Good canons, by the way. The Russian Church has issued canons. Now, in the modern age, there's this sort of even further distancing from, and this is why I won't include it with the three, because I'm not sure if this will even prevail over time. It's like we're in the midst of it now, so you don't know if this will be a thing or a blip on the radar.
Right.
So the blip we have now is you have jurisdictions issuing decisions, directives, right? They won't call it a canon anymore. They'll call it, this is our decision, this is our directive. But for all intents and purposes, they're what canons used to do. They're issuing instructions, do this, do this, do that.
Right. It's just like a language shift.
It's this language shift because it would seem no one wants to owe up to the fact that, yes, we have the Holy Spirit and we could issue a canon, and this, a canon means rule. You have to follow this, right? And they're issuing directives, let's say, and they're not necessarily, see, the difference maybe between a directive and a canon is that canons at least have the ethos of preserving a tradition that allegedly came all the way from the apostles, right? So the reason it's a rule is because this is the way it was always done in most cases, right? So they're saying, yes, we're making a canon, but we're just making a rule what we already considered a rule. We're just spelling it out for you, right? So it's like we have a canon on no eating blood, right? Which we read in Acts chapter 15, right? That's one of the apostolic canons. So all the apostolic canon did was spell out what the scriptures already say. It's not that we think that there was a time that we didn't or something, right? Now you could kind of disagree with this literalistic approach. That's not my point. My point is to show like the canon ideally is to make a rule out of what was already done. But what do you do with like stuff like organ donation or single mothers and whether they commune and stuff like that? You don't have very explicit stuff. Now you have jurisprudence, by the way, which is why jurisprudence is so favored, because you have interpretations and things to go by.
Right.
But sometimes it seems like the synods don't want to do that. They want to do they want to have practical directives, and they want to practically function. And so they go, just do this. And they don't claim that it's timeless or the Spirit necessarily directing it or not. And that is a praxis shift. It's practical for what it's worth. This praxis shift has analogs in Western canon law in the first millennium after the year 500. So it's a practical praxis shift, but it's a praxis shift, and people should be historically aware of it.
Yeah, it does appear like you were talking about kind of the rigidity of the law and things like that. I mean, there is a concept of economia. I think even within, I guess, the modern understanding has kind of differed from the way that it was exercised in the past, whereas it was more of like that's like the exception, or where now today it seems like economia is becoming the rule. So it's no longer this kind of contrasting between economia and acrovia. It's economia almost more often than not. What do you think about that particular instance?
I would agree. And I would say when I was received in the Orthodox Church, I had a priest tell me that in the modern day, we're stretching economia to the very limit. And of course, there's conservative voices within Orthodoxy, whether in Athos or popularly with Father Peter Heers. There are the offshoots of Orthodoxy, of World Orthodoxy anyway, like the True Orthodox, which refuse to accept this sort of canonical approach that what has become allegedly economic or even completely disused is not acceptable.
Right.
But there is this modernistic tendency to turn the exception into the rule. So imagine, I don't know, I'm gonna say a situation that actually occurred, but I'll just say I won't say the jurisdiction or even the denomination for a moment. You're a missionary. You're missionizing a foreign people into Christianity that have polygamy. Now, polygamy does serve a practical function. It provides for the children and the concubines of the husband, right? So if you say, all right, divorce everyone and forget about those kids, there is a real effect on all those people, and that is a testimony of some sort, whether good or bad, about the religion you're evangelizing. And so the decision made by the evangelist in this case was, all right, for those who become Christians, they cannot live polygamously, but they could essentially apart maintain these spouses and family. And their children aren't allowed to obviously acquire multiple wives and whatnot. And so I'll now give the big reveal. This was what the Orthodox did in Alaska when evangelizing the Aleuts. And you could agree or disagree, but I think any reasonable person says, like, at least I could see the logic to this. They're trying to achieve this positive end. And there's these sort of this messiness there's no easy answer to, right? And so imagine if someone saw this exception, right? No one during this point said this should be the rule. But imagine we took this exception and say, well, yeah, we're gonna allow all sorts of people to remarry. To not remarry, to have multiple wives. And, and, they say they're not sleeping with them. That's okay. And they just mess up every so often, or however they compartmentalize that. Right. Because then how do you say how much is too often and all this nonsense?
Right.
Then you pretty much become Mormons. And so this tendency to take exception terms in the rule is really, really bad, because real life has difficulties where you don't have any individual good decision you could actually choose. You could just choose one of two bad decisions, and hopefully you choose the least bad one. And whether you're a Protestant or you're Orthodox or whatever, you work this out. You work this out with your spiritual father, with men of God, with people you trust, that sort of thing. And so what we don't want is for all those decisions then to become, they become rules, that we could do all these aberrant things. This is a bigger issue, which I plan on getting into, like even where if we study some of the gender stuff from the first millennium, we have examples of queens and abbesses that had authority over men. And right? Someone can say, oh, well, they had authority over men. That means normatively, we could have women with authority over men. But the abbess would have never said that, who had the authority over men,
Right.
right? They embrace the exception without saying this should be normative. And it seems like there's a certain OCD in modernity that's incapable of that, but something the pre-moderns did pretty reflexively. They
Yeah.
were able to separate ideals from the nitty-gritty of everyday life, and they kind of embrace the ideals as a direction, so that way they didn't lose their grounding. So let's apply this though real quickly to canon law. We've reached the point where not only the exception is the rule, where canons are, and not that just canonical neglect is a thing, right? Like no, there's no longer kneelers and standers for penances and stuff like that. I'm not aware of any jurisdiction that excommunicates soldiers anymore. Which, when it's a canon from Saint Basil, if the original was if you shed blood, you had lifetime excommunication. Then out of Economia, it was decreased to 3 years because the idea was that people should still know the immensity of taking human life, even when justified, right? Because murder is a whole other, a much
Right.
more
Right.
severe canonical penalty than shedding blood in war. But now no one does it because it's viewed as just unpatriotic. Like, he's defending, defending Ukraine against the Russians, Russia against the Ukrainians, America against the Muslims, all this stuff. But there's a canon, right, that requires penance for shedding blood. And I actually know someone I've met in the real world who he killed someone in self-defense, and the fact his priest didn't give him a penance morally conflicted him, right? And for him, it felt like what I'm being told is that the shedding of blood is meaningless, and this doesn't assuage my conscience. So we've kind of become this reflex where condescending to everyone allegedly assuages conscience, but in reality, it does not. Sometimes people want to pay restitution. That's why
Yes.
Zacchaeus, out of his own heart, paid restitution to those he defrauded, and Christ accepted it, right? So it's sometimes it's not that God needs restitution, right? It's like I forget which psalm, but God's like, I don't eat the blood of bulls and drink the blood of rams, right? If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, says the Lord, right? It's not that God needs it. These things exist because we need it.
Yes.
And that's why the canons provide these rules. These canons were established for man's salvation. They weren't meant to be OCD. That's why there was always economia on an individualistic basis. But in modernity, there's been this there's not only disuse, right? Like, because I don't think anyone's personally offended. All right, we don't have kneelers anymore, but we could just do something else to penalize the person. Okay, and that exists in first millennium too. They could give different penalties. I know the spiritual father knows. You could say, this penance I can't do for this practical reason. Can I do this instead? And usually they say yes, because unless you're being unreasonable. But that being said, like, let's say reception by baptism. The canons are diverse on the question. The canons allow reception by chrismation, provided that the baptism had correct form. I'm not getting to the argument of what constitutes correct form, but it's always triune in some way. I'll just say that. It's always a triple immersion, or secondary form sprinkling if the person was sick, etc. Or by the canons, it can't be a schismatic, it can't be a heretic, blah, 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 right? And it has to be done right. So we have this sort of diversity on it. But what we don't have is the acceptance for single immersion baptisms. I won't say his name out of all respect, because I'm in personal correspondence with this bishop, but he accepts single full immersion baptism of Baptist. And I could see why he's trying to bring people in, and he views the Baptists as Christians and not as like completely apart from Christianity, etc. I live in America too. I get it, right? Strictly canonically, there's just no basis for this. This would be simply saying, I'm not enforcing these canons, I don't agree with them.
Yeah.
And so that exists in modernity. There's only one example pre-schism, but it's fairly prominent. So I just want to point this out. This did exist, and it was tolerated for centuries. So this is why I don't view this as I view this as very aberrant and bad and going in bad directions, but I can't say this lacks precedent, which would be the Council of Trullo. I won't get into details, but if you read secular history, they'll say the council was held because the Muslims took over all these parts of the Roman Empire and created all this chaos. There were no longer easy communication amongst Christians, the Christian East. So these regulations were made from, again, they're reiterating things from earlier councils, in order to create standardization to bring order out of the chaos. So again, the pastoral need is very obvious, right? And so that being said, some of these canons, because they're concerned about the divisions in the East from the Muslim onslaught, are really not all that concerned about Western aberrations.
Mhm.
And so in the West, they rejected these canons initially, but really it only appears for about 20 years. Eventually, they accepted these canons on the basis of some sort of good answer that a Byzantine emperor gave to a Pope of Rome. The Pope of Rome was Pope Constantine, that I remember. I forget the emperor's name. It might have actually, wait, that emperor might have been Justinian this, wasn't Justinian the second. Oh, darn. What was his name?
It was
Maybe
one of those.
Justinian.
One
One
of
of those
those.
dudes. He had his nose cut off. I remember
Yeah.
that. So anyway, and then the Council of Nicaea II, the first canon of Nicaea II, demands acceptance of Trullo and all the other canons. So Trullo is in Western canon law. It's been in Western canon law until 1917, because Gratian's canon law was official till then. And so Rome, for pretty much the whole second millennium, now we're in the third millennium, accepted these canons from the Council of Trullo because it was accepted by the Papacy and their synod. But there's canons that in that council directly contradict Roman practices, both now and then.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently, whatever good answer that the Byzantine emperor gave to Pope Constantine must have been, you could follow your own traditions. The last canon of Trullo says that it's up to the doctor to apply the medicine. So there's this tolerated, purposeful disuse of canons that are in contradiction to local tradition. And this is something that we see repeated and treated as matter-of-factly in the correspondence of St. Photius the Great to Pope Nicholas. Now, this is a letter I've had translated that's not otherwise publicly available, right? So I've read this. Most people haven't read this, that unless they're Greek experts and stuff.
Do you mind if I touch on one thing that you said before
sure,
we
right
move past it? So you were talking about it's up to the doctor to apply the medicine. Now that would be applicable in individual instances in which maybe, a bishop is looking at an individual situation in which he's going to apply maybe, a certain penance.
Yeah,
or
clearly
the
that's the intent of that canon. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But I've seen in modern pop apologetics this kind of line of reasoning that it's just the bishops have the freedom to just reject canons in perpetuity and no longer hold to them, period, point blank. I think that we see that maybe in the more modern church. I don't think that was the understanding of how these canons were meant to be applied in history. What do you think about that?
I'd say yes and no. Like, as I just said with Trullo, we do know that Rome had canons. They might have called it Economia. In fact, there is a letter, now I remember, again, another untranslated letter that I've read by Pope John VIII that does mention this economic interpretation. So Rome was aware of this economic interpretation, but it was a very broad economic interpretation, which for all practical intents and purposes was like this modern change in praxis that you're talking about. That, like, I'm the Pope. I'm Pope, I'm the bishop. If I just want to accept people with single immersion baptism, I'm going to, and he can't tell me no. It doesn't matter. The canons say otherwise, right? And so that's a change of praxis. But it seems like in the first millennium, there was toleration of people, not on an individual level, but on a synodical level, saying we're just not going to apply this canon this way. It's inconsistent with our traditions. But therein, I think, lies the main difference: the traditions. Right. In the modern day and age, we've turned bishops into autocrats. And this is for two reasons: because of what has occurred with the papacy and their ecclesiastical development, but also with Orthodox development, the fall of Constantinople, where the bishop became an ethnarch. For all intents and purposes, he was the secular ruler of Christians within a Muslim empire, because in a lot of parts of that empire, the Christians outnumbered the Muslims. And so it's in history, this is fairly common. You have these sort of puppet kings per se, right? They're kings in their own right, but they're under the jurisdiction of a larger governing body, kind of like Herod under the Roman Empire, right? So it's not that we're unaware of these things. And so this is where, at least it appears to me historically, where even Orthodox bishops began wearing crowns, like king's crowns,
Hmm.
right? They might call them miters because that's the expression from Roman Catholic headgear is a mitre.
Right.
The actual term mitre comes from the headwear of prostitutes, which is kind of interesting if you get into etymology. But this crown that the bishops wear seems to come from the ethnarchs, and you could see this in historical iconography because if you look at bishops before the fall of the Byzantine Empire, because there's saints that are bishops, they're wearing the bishop's clothing and garb, their contemporary garb, and they're not wearing crowns because they didn't wear crowns. And my guess is it would have been a literal interpretation of 1 Corinthians 11, right?
Right.
That lasted for more than 1,000 years. And so, of course, that's a obvious change in praxis. It's a change in headgear. There's little things they do. They take the crowns off when they read the gospel, when they consecrate, etc. But people should be aware of this. Why? Because this idea that these bishops almost like little ethnarchs, right? They're, the chief ethnarch was in Constantinople, and these bishops are kinds of ethnarchs. Comes with it that like they have this kind of authority in of themselves, and they're not bound to synodical authority and canonical authority. And that's what we've reached in modernity, where someone might say, I'm not using this canon, not because of tradition,
Hmm.
right? Because that's what they would have done in the first millennium. In the West, we've always fasted on Saturdays. So we're not going to follow this Trullian canon that says that we can't fast on Saturday, right? So at least their disagreement was based on a tradition that was arguably apostolic, and which is an interesting question. But in modernity, it seems like we're just not going to do this because I'm the bishop and I decide the rules here. But that's sort of like in politics, I'm the president and this executive order, I don't need a law saying I can do
Right.
this.
Right.
And you could even agree. You could agree with what that president is doing, but is it extrajudicial? Is it extra legal? I'm not even going to say illegal. I'm not going to say it contradicts law, but is it beyond and above law? And the answer is yes. And I think we're living in a time where that's becoming so common, where people just think they read into the past that that's how it worked, but the past didn't work that way.
Right. Right. Absolutely. I think those are great points. And what I was trying to get at, and I think you covered it pretty aptly, is that the application of the canons, or at least the understanding at the time of the creation of these canons, of these ecumenical councils, and even of local synods, was not that there is this kind of, because there's this Western distinction of just humanum, just divinum, where there's like a civil law aspect and then there's a divine law aspect. It's like, no, the synod is guided by the Holy Spirit in total, right? Not that I'm not trying to make an argument for like rigid application of each canon, but it
Yeah.
was understood at the time that all of these were divinely inspired, right? It's not as if it was like, well, these are just, we can kind of disregard this
And they
civil
issued
aspect.
curses to those who would disregard them.
Right.
So that's another thing too. Like they would curse you if you disregarded it, which they probably felt was very consistent, like with St. John, the book of Revelation. Anyone who adds to this, they won't have their part, in the tree of life, or
Hmm.
however that exactly is worded. Um, the apostolic constitutions, which is peripherally canonical because Apostolic Canon 85 accepts the apostolic constitutions, and Apostolic Canon 85 is accepted by Canon Trullo. So again, canonists get into this nitty gritty. But apostolic constitutions curses people
Yeah.
for, from defying the canons that are given in the constitutions,
Yeah. I
which
actually
is the
have that.
apostolic canons.
I have that right here. It says, these instructions regarding the canons have been enjoined upon you by us, O bishops. If you adhere to them, you shall be saved and shall have peace. But if you disobey them, you'll be sorely punished and will have perpetual war with one another, thus paying the penalty for heedlessness. So yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, kind of interesting.
yeah. It's they seem to take for granted that, oh, why are there schisms in the church and heresies? Because in every age we have these to varying degrees. Well, it's
Mhm.
because we're not sticking to the boundaries that the fathers have delineated, and this in the pre-schism first millennium discourse is common. They'll take the proverbs where it says, "Do not move a neighbor's boundary stone," and the way they interpret the proverb is that we always follow the authority of the past, of the fathers, of the canons,
Mhm.
that we can't defer from them. and they weren't OCD. So, right, they understood that there are situations so exceptional that, we have to disregard it or something for the sake of salvation. And we have examples of that. But again, there wasn't this modern idea that exceptions became the rule.
Right.
The rule always stayed the rule. It's sort of like we had bishops of Rome that had male concubines that they made cardinals, right? But if you ask that bishop of Rome, is sodomy a sin? He would say, absolutely. Right. So they live these very schizophrenic lives. They,
Yeah.
some of these people, but they understood the canons as having force, and they would have applied those same canons, maybe not to themselves, right? Very selectively. And this kind of, I'll make one sort of observation about what exists historically and into the modern age, which is speaking to priests. I've heard say, well, a bishop told me this in a personal conversation, like sitting in his office. He said the canons are guides, right? So he had this very pastoral approach where something's not literal or explicit in the canon, but it's consistent with the canon. It gives us a direction to go into. And if being overly explicit, the canon leads to problems, we could disregard it. Canons are guides. You can say it's a liberal view, but that's what he said.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've heard another prominent priest tell me, again, in the real world, sitting across from him, that, they only enforce canon law when they want to make someone in trouble because everyone is violating some canon or another. Now, this kind of sounds crazy, what I'm saying, because it sounds like the canons can't be fully enforced. But I just want to remind people of this. We live every day with that legal reality, and we don't find it strange.
Mm-hmm.
If you're American, or especially America has some of the most laws out of any westernized country, you're well aware that where you put your potted plant in front of your house might be against some local variants. What you have on your car, on your rear windshield, because you have a nifty sticker, might be against some local law about obstructions on your rear windshield. All these things, but you just consider it normal. Why? Because we're kind of used to the law being enforced in a commonsensical guidestone sort of way. And there's this common understanding of laws that are enforced in a very consistent, rigid way. So obviously, like murder, right? We're used to that being rigid. Speed limit is rigid in a sense, right? More than 10 over, they'll stop you. Less than 10, they tend not to stop you. And so if you look at canon law, it's so inconsistent. They say that the Holy Spirit said this and you can't deviate, but you have to understand it's
Right.
The way they use the law would have been very similar to how we use the law today. Yes, they could throw the book at you when they want to. And yes, it's when you go way too extreme beyond the canons where they'll actually step up and do something. Because similar now, right? You have to go way past the speed limit for them to want to stop you. And people considered it normal then, just like we consider it normal now. And I'll leave it to others theologically to work out whether that's right or not. I'm just saying it operated like that in the past, and there's analogs to that in the present.
Yeah, and it's not as if the bishops are omnipresent or they're able to kind of sense, like, I can sense someone's breaking the canons right now. So
Yeah.
it's not as if they kind of apply themselves. It does require the bishop to actually go and apply the canon. So there is
there's
that
political
aspect.
considerations too, right?
Right.
Sometimes you don't depose someone right away because you want them to change.
Mm-hmm.
And Christ says this, right? Like, yes, you go privately to them, then you bring witnesses. So like there is precedent with our Lord that you don't just slam someone with the rule and issue the punishment. But of course, people take that to mean, we could just ignore things forever. And of course, it's, there's sexual sins and things like that are ignored forever on a local basis, which is, of course, not justifiable traditionally or canonically, but it comes from that idea, from that spectrum of thought.
All right, so let's close out with a little bit of information about your book. If you want to share where they can get that and talk a little bit about it, that would be good. And then we'll close out after that.
Well, that's great. It's if what we discussed here blessed you, you want more details, you had a lot of nuances here, or details and histories you want unpacked, I recommend my book, The Rise and Fall of the Papacy. The reason why is for years people would tell me, well, what book do you recommend if you want me to understand church history? And I actually go, well, I don't know. I don't recommend any book. The only thing I can think of is you read all these. These are the minutes of all the ecumenical councils right here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only way you really understand a lot of the nitty gritty of how they thought and operated. But even that I don't recommend for everyone. It's dry legal writing. If you're used to reading law, it might make sense, but otherwise it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so eventually, I won't get to details how, I wrote a book which actually encapsulates my learning from the history in a way that's accessible. And so that's available in Ryan's Fall, the Papacy. I have Roman Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox all like it. And it's been said by some to be the best apologetic book on the papacy, really since Denny's Papalism. The best written by an Orthodox. And to quote Roman Catholic apologist Sean Kalarafi, the best book written by the other side. So I do think it's something that people will profit from if they purchase the book. And that being said, otherwise, I would say, just to support my ministry in Cambodia, they could go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate if they want to they want to bless the missionary work that's done there. We're translating saint lives into Khmer, as well as trying to fix something that the Cambodian government knocked down in front of one of the churches, like the fence that keeps people out at night. And stuff like that. So donations, of course, are appreciated. And yep, that's everything I'd like to plug.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel. Anybody who's watching the video, I'm going to have Craig Truglia's links in the description of this video. If you want to check out his book, I'll have the link for that in the description. And then if you want to check out his channel and website, things like that, I'll include those there as well. But thank you so much for coming on. It was a blessing to have you here. A lot of great information. God bless you.
Thank you.